Author is funded by the Pacific Northwest Writers Association, supporting writers from pen to publication since 1955. To learn more about the PNWA and their yearly conference, please go to pnwa.org. Hi, Ruth. How are you doing?
Hi, Bill. How are you?
I'm good. Wow, what a turnout.
I know. This is nice.
I see a lot of author events, and they don't always. So
yeah.
Well done.
Yeah.
So, all right. So this is an interesting book. There's a lot in it. There's, you got a couple narrators. You got someone who maybe is you. I don't know. Maybe. You've got footnotes, appendixes. You've also got lots of philosophy, but you also have a story.
Thank you.
There is a story in there. So I want to start with that. Can you remember when the concept that story mattered to you first lit up?
In my life?
Yes, just story, period.
Yeah. I don't remember a single moment when it happened. I don't remember a single moment when it happened. However, I do remember a time when I lied. And I think that's actually, and so when you say when story mattered, I think that was the moment when I lied, because I realized I needed to make up a story, right? Because I was going to be in trouble.
For protection.
Of course, because and it was in second grade, and I was in Palo Alto. I was in East Palo Alto, California, and my parents had given me a watch. And so this is actually very timely. This is a very, very actually relevant question that you just asked. They had given me a Timex watch, and they gave it to me so that I could tell the time and so that I could get myself home in time for dinner, right? Because those were the days when children, if you remember this, some of you who are as old as the hills like I am, we used to just go outside and play, right, by ourselves, right? Yeah. And so, it was my job to get myself home by 5 o'clock for dinner. And I realized that you could turn the hands of the clock backwards, right? And you could actually gain another 5 or 10 minutes of playtime, because those 5 or 10 minutes were so crucial. If you remember how just 5 or 10 minutes, right? And you could do that. And so I did that, and I lied, and I kept saying, well, I think my watch must be broken. And finally, I think my parents must have realized that I was lying, but yeah.
But you were like a little philosopher in formation, because you're already seeing that time was really conceptual.
Exactly. But I didn't have that language. I didn't have the language at that age to say, Mom, Dad, time, it's conceptual. It expands, it contracts. It's just numbers.
If you could have said that, they would have forgiven
anything. That's right. They would have.
Man.
Darn.
All right. But so that's when you noticed that fiction, which is what that was.
That's right.
Was useful.
That's right. And I've never stopped lying since.
That's not. So I interview a lot of writers, and that's one way in, is the lie.
Yeah.
You make stuff. Yeah. It's this is interesting.
Yeah.
But the lie, if we must call it that, has to be, even like yours, with the watch, has to be structured around reality. It has to be grounded in what we call reality.
Yeah, because when I tried the mom, an alien, came down and abducted me, and I don't remember what happened for the last half an hour. That lie didn't work very well.
No.
That did not go over very well.
And that's what the novelist has to do to some, doesn't have. They can write about the alien coming down, but even then they've got to do it in a way that's believable.
Yeah. And I think, it's I guess I don't really see this as being a binary opposition, because I don't really see much as being a binary opposition. But I see sort of this reality fiction as being more of a continuum, right? And so it's a question more of where you place yourself along the continuum. That's one thing. And then the other thing is the contract that you have with the person you're speaking to. So, for example, if we're sitting here talking, we have a kind of contract that I'm going to tell the truth. Right. Well, I mean,
to the best of your ability.
To the best of my abilities, and I'm going to tell the truth, right? Yep. And so that's a contract that we make, and then you make certain assumptions based on that. And that's why I think we have genre distinctions. That's why, some books are labeled fiction and
Yes,
some
yeah,
are
yeah,
labeled
yes.
nonfiction. Because that's really about the, the contract. And that's why we get so upset when, for example, James Frey, writes
Yes,
a book
yes.
and lies, or whatever,
But so your character of Ruth in this is trying to write a memoir,
Yeah.
and she's not having much luck. And
Yeah,
the
that's right.
memoir is such a, I don't know if you've ever attempted it like completely on your own, but the idea of reality
Yeah.
in the memoir is kind of a joke in a way.
Well, exactly, and so that is the joke in the book, of course, too, because the character of Ruth is trying to write a memoir, and she's failing to write it because she's so distracted by this diary that washes up on the shore and actually that's kind of like what happened to me too. I mean, I was also trying to write a memoir in real life. The writer Ruth was trying to write a memoir, and then this idea for a novel just kept coming back and haunting me and pulling me away from it. And so, the way I look at the Ruth section of the book, because just if anybody for people who haven't read the book is set up as a dialogue between a young girl who's writing a diary and the novelist Ruth, who finds the diary and becomes kind of obsessed with it, right? And so the novelist Ruth, the memoir that she's trying to write is in fact the memoir that I was trying to write. And she's failing to write it in exactly the way that a novelist would fail to write a memoir, right? She turns it into a fiction.
Right.
So thus that half of the book gets born, right?
Okay, so this is so interesting to me. I'm endlessly interested in that moment where something says, where the author says, that's interesting. I can't get my imaginative eye off of it. And so I know how these things grow from a little seed, but what was that seed?
For this book?
Yeah.
It started for me with the voice of the girl. And it's
I
always the
knew
voice,
it.
right?
I
Yeah,
knew it.
it's always a voice.
It's a great
always
voice,
a voice.
yeah.
It's always a voice, and you never know where that voice comes from. But usually, I've found that with all of the books and with most of the writing that I do, that there's a voice that comes, and sometimes it's a voice of a character, as it was in this, but sometimes it's the voice of the novel itself that kind of announces itself and starts to speak to you. And for the second book, for example, for All Over Creation, it was those first kind of grandiose lines, It starts with the earth. How can it not? Imagine the planet like a split peach whose, pit forms the core, et cetera, et cetera. And so it was this kind of grandiose voice that sort of announced itself. With this, though, it was very much the voice of the character now. And I remember this very clearly. It was in December of 2006. I first heard the voice, and I typed down the first lines of the book. Hi, my name is Now, and I'm a time being. Do you know what a time being is? If you give me a moment, I will tell you. And so that was the thing that first, I think, sort of, for some reason, came into my head, and then I just couldn't forget it.
Well, God, that's so interesting. And so the concept of the time being, I mean, all I knew about the book was the title.
Yeah.
And then I opened it up and I said, oh, that's clever.
Yeah.
And so did you know, did the time being come from before you started writing it?
Oh, yeah. The phrase time being was, once again, it kind of stuck in my mind, right? And it comes from, or at least it first entered my mind when I was reading the writing by a 13th century Zen master named Dogen Zenji, right? And Dogen wrote extensively about time, and in fact was one of the few people who wrote about time as a spiritual issue, which I think is kind of a no-brainer when you think about it, right? Because most of our spiritual crises come because we are time beings with a time limit, and we know that, right? And so, so all of our spiritual crisis is an attempt to resolve that somehow. And so, so Dogen had written extensively about time, and he wrote one essay in particular called Uji. Okay, and Uji in Japanese can be translated two characters. One is the character for, U is the character for being, and Ji is the character for time, right? So you can translate it as being time, or because it's Japanese, it's kind of flexible, you can also translate it as time being, or you can translate it as for the time being, because it can be read in a different way entirely. It can be read as arutoki. Okay, it can be either read in Chinese as uji or in Japanese as arutoki. And arutoki means, at that time or for the time being, right? And so So this phrase was interesting because I was reading it in translation, and the translation I was reading had translated it time being. And depending on how you inflected that phrase, it could mean very different things. It could either be time being or time being. Right. So one of them is a being, one of them is an entity, a being, like a human being or an alien being, right, a space being. The other is, of course, this idea of temporality, right? And so, and so this was really interesting to me, and I think because the phrase is kind of unstable, it didn't really want to resolve. Right, so it kind of hung around. It hung around in my mind, and then before I knew it, it was being uttered by the character of this young girl now. Yeah.
It's just great.
Yeah.
How long did you know? How long did it take you to know that she had a Jiko?
Oh, good question.
Did it take you to meet her? Who's her grandmother?
The old great-grandmother. Yeah, great-grandmother.
Yeah.
Old Jiko is a 104-year-old great-grandmother. She's a Zen Buddhist nun. And she's not just any Zen Buddhist nun. She's an anarchist feminist Zen Buddhist nun. Right. She's actually an anarchist feminist novelist Zen Buddhist nun, so it gets even more complicated. Right. I don't remember when old Jiko sort of came into the picture. That's a really good question. I could go back and look in my notes, but
So she wasn't there right away?
She wasn't there right away.
Okay.
Though, wait a minute. No. Okay. Now I'm putting it together again. I'm reconstructing this in time. I realized that she was there quite soon because Nal started texting her almost immediately.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think that within the first 20 pages or so, old Jiko had sort of come into being because Nal had a cell phone and was texting her. And she was I think probably when Nal started to text, I didn't know exactly who she was texting. But then suddenly I realized, oh, she's texting this old woman, and it was odd because I remember actually being a little bit surprised because her great-grandmother was so old, and it was like, oh, interesting, she texts.
Yeah.
She's like 104 years old, and she texts. Interesting, right?
You said something earlier, and so when I teach writing, I try to let the students know that don't look upon writing, this is the language you just used, as thinking.
Yes,
look upon it as listening.
Yes.
It's listening.
It's really.
You look like you're thinking.
Yeah.
And maybe it's hard. I'm sure there's a lot of writers out here, but maybe some are just devoted readers. It might seem odd because, well, who are you listening to? It's just you.
Yeah.
But that's really the vibration you have to achieve to write authentically.
Yeah.
So maybe talk about
Well, no,
that.
I think that's really true because I think the difference is that thinking is something that you're doing, right?
Yeah.
Whereas listening is, you're doing it, but you're receiving. You're in a kind of a more, not passive. It's not passive. It's an active kind of listening.
It's an attuned
but
listening.
You're receptive, right?
Yeah.
You're receptive.
Yeah.
And I think that's really true. I also, though, sometimes get the feeling that that the characters are just out there, that they are just kind of there and they're floating around in the ether, I always think of it as this kind of like primordial kind of Pirandellian soup, and they're kind of floating around out there, and then, they look through the clouds and they see a novelist walking by and they go, oh, there's a good one, and whoom, they come down and they parasitize your brain.